Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to all of you who are tuning in or will come in on live. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing to you one of our most recent authors, Omar Sabbagh, who has published an absolutely extraordinary collection of novels, of poetry, and this one is called "Night Settles Upon the City." And the city in this case is Beirut in Lebanon, which many of you will be aware has been suffering enormous attacks both in Beirut and in the south of Lebanon by Israel in its extension of its genocidal attacks against the Palestinians. So it's a great pleasure then to welcome Omar. Thank you so much for sparing time to join us. You're in Beirut at the moment.
Yes, yes. Um, Pleasure, absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you again for making this possible, both the
No,
book and this meeting itself.
no, that's great. I'm so glad that you're able to find time to join us. It's an amazing collection of books, but of poetry in this book. And I just wonder, before we sort of really get into more details about it, um, as I understand it, you're a PPE. What is PPE in Oxford? Which doesn't sound like a poetry and poems degree. How does somebody who has studied that field, philosophy, politics, and economics, how does somebody become a poet?
Right. Well, there's a few different answers for that. Firstly, I've been quite academically active since my first degree in PPE in different subjects: literature, creative writing, and philosophy and politics, and so on. But the truth is that I was never at the right place at the right time in any of my degrees. I was either before or beyond them. I was never at the right place. So when I was at Oxford doing PPE, for 2 or 3 years, apart from lazing around, I would spend my time reading novels and Shakespeare and things like that. Although I was still interested in philosophy and politics mainly. And so when I finished that degree, I took a gap year and then I did an MA in English literature at King's. And I hadn't done English literature at A level even, let alone undergraduate degree. But I did very well. I came, I think, third in the class of 55 during that MA. I did quite well because I'd been a bookish person for a very long time. It's a very young age. And for me, I'll tell you what I think about this, that as a poet or even as a short fiction writer, but as a writer of any sort, the way I work, you start off by reading in certain subjects, philosophy, history, literature, whatever it is. But eventually, if you get enough exposure and sensitization, you get to a stage in your writing career where writing is just writing, whether you're writing a philosophical essay, a poem, or a short story. And so for me, I suppose what the bridge between different subjects to end up being a poet and a writer would be that it's just the English language. That's the kind of bridge. I like to say that, and this sounds extremely pompous, but I'm so wedded to English. It's like a part of my body. So wherever I use it in a prose or verse, I get the same satisfaction, the same thrill, the same uh, uh, success at times, I suppose. So when I look back, um, it doesn't really matter so much to me if I look back in time what subject I was studying. It was just the ability to read, write, and think. I might not have known it at the time, but now I realize that any opportunity to spur my thinking by reading and therefore writing has all been one kind of trajectory. And there's a thing. I think there was a Greek poet, George Seferis, who won the Nobel Prize, I believe. He was once asked, without trying to claim some sort of comparative status, obviously, he was once asked about his influences, and he said in response, he didn't like that question because he found it specious. Because he said, "You ask a lion which meal created its mane or its legs. Everything that you read and think and do feeds into your writing seamlessly. And it's not like you have to study. I've done it. I've studied English literature and creative writing and so on in courses. But I really don't think, in my view at least, the way it works for me, that I had to have studied those courses to be the poet I am or the writer I am today. It would have happened anyway. The time given by being able to afford doing degrees and postgraduate degrees was excellent and actually helped me a lot. But it wasn't. I don't feel like that my writing career is tied to a degree or some sort of academic structure. If I'm being
Mhm.
honest.
Right. Okay. And but you are now located in Lebanon, in Beirut, and many of your poems in this collection speak to the experience of violence that is being experienced there. Um, Give us some sort of idea of what inspired you to bring this collection together? Because it's fairly recent, although there are some which are much older, written in Dubai and elsewhere.
Um,
So
Yeah, I mean, I was putting together in late August, early September, a new and selected. I was trying to pitch it to various people because I'd published six collections and a half, a pamphlet with Cinnamon Press. And most of that poetry was confessional, lyrical, more to do with me and my relationships than to do with any public or official or political situation. Then the attack started in Beirut with the pager attacks. And I began impulsively just writing up my registering of events. And when I get into that zone, I end up being producing a lot of work. And this time, because it's happened many times before, I go through these kind of cycles or waves of productivity. And this time, the majority, but not all, the majority of the work was, passable or good poetry. And I think it was because I had something specific to write about. It wasn't me with the urge to write and then manufacturing a subject to just use language. There was something there objectively impactful to describe and reflect upon. So it kind of trained my impulsiveness to create work which was not only productive, but also, pertaining and relevant. And I always say this. I mean, in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, I don't know if you know it, he talks about artistic creativity, and he says there's a kind of madness. Well, I think the Greek word was manikos, to creative efforts. And when I get into one of my waves of production, I end up becoming a little bit like a manic person. I end up producing a lot of work on a regular basis, and it's like a healthy thing. I think it's not a bad kind of madness. You might lose a bit of perspective, but it's sort of endemic to being a certain temperament. And so I produced a lot of work over a month and a half, writing out of Beirut, talking about events or situations and reflecting upon them. And eventually, before I got to the suggestion of the effort to put together this collection, I realized that the in my new and selected, which I was adding to, the new had become a new book. So the new and selected were selections from six and a half books, and the last section of new poetry had become big enough for its own book. So then I thought, well, why not do a book on Beirut? Put them together and make it a single collection about Beirut. And I knew of Daraja Press from a couple of colleagues or literary friends, and I approached you, and you were kind enough to be enthusiastic about the project. So it was great. Um, and I've written about Beirut before. I have my first novella was called Via Negativa, a parable of exile, and that was kind of Beirut centered as well. But this book, I think, um, is just more poignant because we're not just dealing with Beirut and Lebanon, grosso modo. We are in a specific situation that deserves and merits witness of any sort, really.
yeah, I mean that's what struck me, that there is a sort of elemental passion here, and it's not speaking on behalf of it. You're still located in a safe area in Beirut, and you speak from there, but you speak with passion and empathy, and I think that comes across quite powerfully. Um, I just wonder, would you be willing to perhaps read one of your poems? I was thinking maybe the one that is the title of the book,
I'd
Night
love to.
Settles.
I'd
Please,
love to.
yeah.
Um, so, um, hi. Well, this piece, which was written evening during a night time, so kind of that was the original spur.
Mhm.
And like most of the book, and that's kind of why I like the fact that you're putting it up on the screen as well, because my poetry, I mean, I like to think my poetry works as read out poetry, but it also is very much, I hope, works on the page as a text, because I try and discipline all that's heartfelt and hopefully at least, or potentially at least, worthy with some sort of poetic rule or discipline for each poem. It doesn't have to be anything particular, but just some sort of sense of delimitation of the infinite when you're writing. And that kind of not only disciplines the poem, but also makes it in part. You know, when you're using features like rhyme or rhythm of certain sorts, they prod you in certain ways, and some ways are helpful, some ways are not. But this poem, "Night Settles Upon the City," was written at night in a kind of um, reflective mood, a kind of night settling mood. The verb settling kind of captures the tone. So I'll read it, if I may. Um,
Please.
Night settles upon the city. Night settles upon the city. A panther's pelt slowly curving round us, rich and blue and voluptuous, enveloping us like memory of the things we couldn't abide and of the things we could. Purple mixed with a thick-set umber, the night sky's a hand filled with soil that might have made so much, flower after treasured flower, but which now can only fail to start what might have been. Such bounteous hopes, such childhood. The world has a rich man's seal embossed upon it, blood red wax stamped upon the unopened letter, whose words spell out the detail of dreams now snuffed, desires quashed beneath the attack of this dark and violent animal.
Ah,
So yeah, that poem is in the first Beirut section of the book, which is titled subtitled "War Diary," and it's the title poem, as you said. Um,
yeah. Sorry, I thought something went wrong there, but here you are.
no
And
worries.
beautiful. And it does strike me about poetry that although it is nice to have it in print, it's more in need of being sung than it is to be read. I'm particularly struck by listening to you to this poem. The interpretation of it is, in a sense, much deeper, much richer than reading it as a manuscript.
Yeah, I mean that's where the soul comes in because I would guess. I mean nowadays this is topical because we have this all the technology about AI and Chat GPT. And according to that technology, a poem of 100 words is just 100 words put together in that order with those letters. Whereas I have to feel as a writer, and as I think many writers might feel this, at least of a certain generation, that there's something more than the sum of the parts about what you do when you write a poem or a short story. And that soul, that kind of seam that goes purposefully through the words, which retrospectively are just so many words put together, that seam comes alive by the way you read it because then you kind of your intentionality you can actually show what was going on in your heart or primed before you wrote the poem. I'm a big believer of the idea that writing and poetry in particular, there's something about poetry that is more than the sum of all poems. There's something about poetry that is like the larynx to the voice, the condition of the words, the present words, the positive words, is something that is more than all the positive words that you put on the page. There's something, I think, transcendental about poetic articulation, and that makes a piece um, I suppose the word would be original, right? Rather than just an amalgamation of certain letters and syllables and words and so on. And that's topical today because nowadays people, if they don't believe it, they act like a text is just so many things put together, so many parts, just notes and ones put together. But I believe there is something meaningful about literary text that is so like, in the sense that it's a seam that goes through the middle of the parts, is beyond them somehow. Um,
Yes,
and that comes
yeah,
across when I try and read the poem, so.
yes, yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting book because there's a combination of both uh, poetic political commentary on the situation in Lebanon, but there's also some very personal writing. Uh, so I mean, in relation to both, I mean, who did you or did you? I mean, perceive as your main audience?
Um, I don't think it was anyone in particular. I tend to, when I'm writing the poetry that works, it's a musical urge, a musical inkling in the back of my mind, a tone, a voice that gets me
Mhm.
gets me started. And when I write about, I've written a lot in my poetic career about family relationships, parents, sisters, brothers, cousins, love relationships, and other things, my daughter, and so on. And in this book, there are many poems which kind of map both personal and political situations, insofar as you may guess, anyone watching, I'm born and bred UK. Lebanon was planted in my head from a young age in a heroic sense, but I never lived it. Until my 30s, I'd never lived in Lebanon. I'd only visited. So it was always a kind of heroic notion for me about Lebanon, never having lived the texture of it. So when I write about Lebanon and I write about my father, for example, when I write about my father, I'm also writing about Lebanon. When I write about Lebanon, in a way, it's rooted in my feelings for my parents because they
Mm.
are the bridge between me and Lebanon, never having fully grown up here or fully been rooted in the country. So they often enough they overlap, and it's actually useful. And if I look back on it, it looks useful because one has a fund of emotion and feeling for these relationships which are personal. If you can tap into them when you're writing about something which is more public or political, then in a way you're making good use of your inner reservoir. And there's one thing that's interesting to talk about is that I grew up in London thinking of Lebanon in a very fluky way. I mean, until I wrote a book called Cedar, which was narrative verse about Lebanon, and I began to read and understand more about it, interviewing people. I thought Lebanon was the vision that my parents' generation had in the 50s and 60s, which was a very golden era. I thought that was the norm. Then I read a bit and interviewed people who are older and younger than me, and I realized what I thought was the norm was a fluke of history. That 10-year gap, 55 to 65, when my parents' generation grew up and their generation, flourished, had this vision, but it wasn't the norm. That 10-year gap was literally the only time that Lebanon has been in any way kind of integrated and hopeful. So in a way, learning about Lebanon, living in Lebanon is both disenchanting, but it's also good to begin to see Lebanon for what it is and not overly romanticize it, because otherwise you can't do anything about anything if you're thinking in these kind of non-practical ways. And so part of the book, one of the poems is Poetry Makes Nothing Happen, which is a phrase from an Auden poem. But the book, I hope, does make something happen because if it moves readers, either in Lebanon, Lebanese or not, it will have, I hope, brought to awareness some of the suffering that I might not be personally going through, but which I feel with. And it's only miles away, by the way. It's no longer South Lebanon, which is like Ukraine for some people. It's a few miles down the road that they're
Yeah,
bombing. As
yeah,
you said, I'm privileged. I live in a part of Beirut that isn't normally targeted, but when it's a few miles away, you can no longer really disconnect as much.
yes. Um, would you like to read that the one you just referred to from Auden's book, Auden's poem?
I'd rather read one about the CNN, etc. I think I would like to read that if I might.
Okay, yeah, no, sure.
Um,
And then there's also the old man with a walking stick,
yeah, they're
which
both dedicated to my dad, who's a
yes,
political.
yeah,
He's
uh,
never been a politician, but he's always been a very very politicized person. So he's very much
yes,
into the politics here. And CNN, etc. is a poem that describes him literally in the TV room. We're watching the news constantly, and he kind of puts his hands in it's a gesture he has. He does this to reflect a bit. He puts his head in his hands. So I ended up just
mhm.
describing that and then infusing it with a certain message to do with, the media and what's going on here. So yeah.
Okay. So why don't you?
Okay.
Uh,
So yeah, this is CNN, etc., dedicated to Muhammad Sabbagh, my father. Um, I'll read it now. The old man buries his head in his hands, his eyes downcast, lowered. The inside of his palms are secret maps he seems to be questioning. His jowls have grown looser and flabbier of late. His heart has aged. This is Beirut, he seems to say, a place for an old man to get heavier and older. Though the TV still blares its rot, he doesn't seem to be listening anymore as the day's end dies as we've come to expect. Bombs, the night's fluting. The news person waxes on. But what's to understand? That murder can be finessed, that violence and hate can find themselves told in a smoothening, softening tale. The old man shivers with the cold. The collateral damage grows on the screen. These are the fallen petals from the sun sprang flowers of what might have been. He looks up now with tears in both his eyes. This is Lebanon, he whispers, the land of my fathers.
wow, wow, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite from the book. Actually, I wrote it quite quickly, but I felt that it was successful from the first draft, and I was happy with it, and I've read it a few times to a few people, and they all kind of find it interesting and moving. I hope so. Yeah.
Oh no, beautiful, beautiful. Um, but I mean, you give expression to lots of emotions and feelings, uh, and yet you say at one part that poetry should not be therapeutic, which I found. Why not? I mean, why should it
Well,
not be?
it's an old idea from T.S. Eliot, I think, that drives me, which is the idea that the more successful the poet, the more detached he is, the more objective he is. I actually think there's a middle ground. Yes, be therapeutic, but therapeutic at one degree away. If you think of poetry as just directly transitively therapeutic, um, you're missing out the art, which is like the ability to reflexively reflect on what you're feeling and make the right decisions of commission and omission. Um, and so I don't think you should be like detached. I mean, it should be therapeutic, but therapeutic at one level of abstraction away from direct transitive, because otherwise, um, you end up. It becomes harder to know as a poet or as a writer, and obviously every reader has their own view. But it becomes harder to know when you're writing stuff which you think is worth something at a poetic level, and when it's not. It becomes, completely on the same plane. And that's fine because the message is always worthy if you're feeling with people and so on. But as a writer myself, I like to also have that element of knowing where the art of poetry is being successful as a poem and not just as an intention to express fellow feeling, empathy, and so on. So it's a kind of mixture of both the objective and the
So,
subjective.
but what about from the reader's point of view?
Well, I think I put it this way. I mean, I teach creative writing, so this is how I teach it. I sort of say, look, Language is not you. Language is an objective societal possession. You've got your subjective intention, whether it's an emotion, a thought, or what have you, and you have the objective medium of language, which you don't own. And you have on the other side of language other subjective readers, right? So I think that's where the art comes in. You have to be able to know how to manipulate, to manumit the objective, to get across what's subjective on this side to the subjective on the other side. And that becomes the effort to use language successfully. The art, the configuring artistry behind either a poem. It doesn't have to be a poem. It could be a short story. It could be a philosophical essay. But I do believe that using language as an art with the right kind of sensibility or choices made is the essence. Because, as I say, you are subjective and you are infinitely detached from the subjectivity of your or whoever readers on the other side, who you might not ever meet. And to allow to get what's true about you on the other side becomes a skill, and that's where I think being good with language or being able to know how to use language in the right ways is the key. Because, as you say, my readers, I don't know what my readers think. I will never access unless they write to me. But I would like to have some go at intentionally guiding them in some way. So
Hmm. Hmm. So give me some idea about what is happening in Lebanon and what is happening in Beirut. Uh, a lot has happened since we published the book, and the Israeli attempts at invasion physically across the border seems to have been thwarted quite successfully. But there's the bombing continues. So how do you see what not just what's happening, what is the future now?
I mean, I'm not the most clued in politically, the nitty gritty of the sects and the different kind of day to day politics. But my view is this: I don't think there will be, for example, a new civil war for two reasons. Spiritually and financially, the country's defunct. No one has the urge for it in terms of politics, and no one can afford it either, to be honest. And this was even before the Israeli attack, when people were saying that Lebanon was troubled. It always has been troubled, but in today's environment, no one can afford, even if they wanted to set up some sort of you know situation like that. And we hear. I was shocked when I first heard the jets going through the sound barrier. It sounds to someone who's not accustomed to it like a bomb. It's like a big kind of explosion sound.
Boom.
And I'd go to my parents and say, "Was that a bomb?" And they'd be like, "No, that's just the sonar or whatever breaking the sound barrier." But I've heard explosions. I felt them, tremors, and you're torn between two different feelings because it's happening a few miles away, and you can't but feel horrified for the people who are perishing, and most of them, all of them, I think, innocent, but most of them innocent by any standard, in the sense that they're not combatants in any sense. Um, but another part of you, and this is just a survival mechanism, I think. Um, I won't say ignores it, but tries to get on, not to spend too much time mulling over it. I mean, you get to a point where you think, if I'm going to be bombed, what can I do? I'm not going to stop a missile from a drone coming into my house or to a car or whatever. So there's a kind of liberation in that feeling, actually. And I think it applies to the country as a whole. I was having a conversation the other day. I was saying that although it sounds terrible, and this, in one sense, it is terrible, there's a kind of opportunity in Lebanon on the back end of all this horror and this crime and these crimes, these war crimes. When you get to the point of ground zero, when you get to the point of no return, the only way left is up. The only way left is unity. The only way left is hope and some new start. So,
Mhm.
although I would never, and I never would, and never will, wish any of these horrible attacks on anyone, if you look at the situation now, um, in a way, the worse things get, the only way, the better they can only get. I mean, because Lebanon has needed a jump start for so long, because she's been in these vicious cycles of so many different things for so long, with it politics, corruption, wars, infighting, that something like this actually might unify the country and put politics and politicking on a back burner. But I don't know. I mean, that's just like optimistic thinking.
So, I mean, here we are on the day after the election in the US.
Yeah.
Resurgence of Trump and his gundas. How's that going to affect things?
I think, I mean, the war will end in Lebanon and in Gaza, obviously, because there has to come a time when they've bombed enough and they can't bomb three times the same place. But my inkling is if the Americans are going to stop it, they're going to stop it in January when Trump goes into power because he wants the credit for it, I think. If I'm thinking like a politician, um, he will stop it. They won't stop it now, but they'll stop it in January so he can say he's the peacemaker. And that's my guess. So, I mean, because at the end of the day, it is America. I mean, Israel is as powerful as it is, but ultimately, without the green light and the support of America, nothing happens. They
It's an
make the law.
American war, but isn't
Yeah.
America after Iran as well?
Well, I
That
was thinking about,
Israel is a good proxy for that.
yeah, I mean, I think when they make a deal, which they have to eventually, I'm hoping anyway, I can't go on for war forever. They'll probably, it'll probably be something like, Iran won't be attacked, sanctions will be lifted in a year's time. There are things that are left to bargain with. And Lebanon is in a position of helplessness most of the time. And that leads to desperation. And so while I would love, as someone wishing well for the country and hoping it reemerges, what I would love for the resistance and for the fighting of injustice to continue, there comes a point in time when you have to say, well, bread and dignity. Yes, dignity is very important, but if you're not there with enough bread, I mean that metaphorically, then what's the point of dignity? If you know what I mean. So I don't take part in politics. I don't do anything really politically, but I do believe that the bread and I mean, I was having a conversation the other day. I mean, a lot of the countries in the Middle East that have restricted their interests to bread, metaphorically speaking, are doing very well. Those are the Palestinians and Lebanese who put a premium on identity, culture, honor, dignity, these kinds of things, are the ones who are suffering. If you're breaking down politics into like bread and dignity, the old kind of adage, and I think there has to be more realism. Injustice hurts the most because it's the worst feeling in the world to be the victim of injustice. But you also have to live to feel justice or to go towards justice. So there has to be the right kind of marriage between um, identity, cultural pride, honor, sovereignty, belief in one's sovereignty, and the measures that might actually keep you alive enough to kind of see those things. So yeah, that's the way I think about it. Very speaking very abstractly.
There's another poem that you wrote about the old man, his walking stick.
Yeah.
Would you like to give us a
Yeah,
rendering
I'd
of
love
that?
to read. This is actually one of my favorite pieces. It ends the second. Well, I should say, the book has three main sections. The first section is subtitled "War Diary," and it has poems mainly about Beirut. And the last section has called poetry. The subtitle "Poetry Makes Nothing Happen." More poems on Beirut, and this poem ends the second section on Beirut. And it's another one for my father. My father is 84 years old, and over the last year, he's deteriorated a little bit in his physical health. He uses a walking stick now and is having back problems. The things that we expect at that sort of age. And so this poem is about the old man and his walking stick is about two kinds of war mapping onto each other. Yes, we have the literal situation here in Beirut, but we also have the more metaphysical war zone of mortality. And this poem tries to map the two onto each other. And it's another way of saying, I suppose, that the source of my feeling for Lebanon is in part rooted in and determined by my relationship with my parents, who were the ones who instilled me with my patriotism rather, sorry. So the old man and his walking stick. It gets worse each day, watching him aging, the drain that seems to drag at his limbs, spindly and white and slowly thinning, watching the old man as he begins to return to his beginnings. A predictable route. I idolize the wiseacre, a newborn son each dawn, rising each day to start to pay the debt I'll still be owing when I'm an old man, if that ever happens, if my life withstands the draining force of being misunderstood time and time again. And because he's good and honest, and because what's right maps so well upon the angles of his most intimate wishes, I mourn for him now, well before he passes, wishing to be for him another walking stick, dispatching prayers in the only language rich enough to transcend the way things are. An old man and his son, fighting a war in a war zone we all must visit. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. It's been a real pleasure for me to be able to both read and publish your book, and to engage with you as well. And uh, we're only now for the first time seeing each other.
Yeah, yeah. But I want
So,
to say thank you, Firoz, for all your efforts. I'm really pleased with this book, and I'm very proud of it. And I want to say thank you because not only did you publish it, but you put in a lot of effort to get it out there quickly. It must have been a lot of work, and I was very appreciative of that. I think it's reached some people already, friends and family, and other people have told me it resonates with them, and so it's a good move to try and get the book out there when we got it out on time because it actually helps people. I think a lot of people find it relief to read that bearing witness can actually help to the situation, at least spiritually, if not materially.
well, we were keen to catch history on its wings, and I think and it was important to get it out. And I think we are receiving other manuscripts. People are coming in because they too want to uh, give to do the same thing to catch history on its wings, and I think that's a really important role that Baraja can play. But it's been a real pleasure to have you on this show, Omar, and thank you for choosing us as your publisher of this book. And I look forward to continue reading. You're very kind. You keep sending me lots of new poems that you're writing, which is wonderful. So thank you for that. And I hope that your books eventually arrive. I gather they're stuck in Dubai.
For a little bit.
Um, yeah, but uh, we'll keep our fingers crossed that they hope they'll eventually get there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh, so thank you for joining us on this show, and I look forward to us being in touch again soon.
great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All the best from
I've been
Beirut.
talking. I've been talking to Omar Sabbagh, author of this wonderful book, which is available from Daraja Press website. Thank you for joining us on this show, and I look forward to us um, talking again. We have a comment from one of my other favorite poets, Yahya Nababiri, who has been on online, saying, "Wonderful to see this catching history on its wings. Powerful work." Thank you, Yahya, for joining us, and thank you, Omar. And we will be returning to the show in due course. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.